Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sally Aiken, and I'm a professor and Associate Dean Research in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC. I want to start off by acknowledging that UBC's Point Grey campus is situated in the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I am joining you today for this webinar from Quadra Island, which is the traditional territory of the Wiwaikai and Wiwatkum nations, as well as other Coast Salish people. And I feel very privileged to be a guest on these lands. So on behalf of the Faculty of Forestry, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you joining us today from wherever you are across BC, across Canada, or elsewhere in the world. And these webinars have been one of the few bright points in the last 15 or so months that we've all been so isolated. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you're having any audio or visual or video issues, please reach out via the live chat feature in GoToWebinar. I just had a whole bunch of those problems, so I'm happy that we've gotten through those and there are people that can help you online. So let's get to today's topic. Well, if you're like me, you enjoy getting out in nature, and particularly in our parks, whether we are hiking, mountain biking, skiing, or camping. And when we come across wild animals or they come across us, it's a real thrill and one of the real joys of being out there. But what impact are people having on the wildlife that these parks are intended to protect and conserve? In recent years, outdoor recreation in parks has grown dramatically in British Columbia, and it's also activities that contribute significantly to the provincial economy. But parks are where we conserve and protect biodiversity as well. And during the pandemic, we all know how important it's been to get outside and get into parks when we haven't been able to do things indoors or travel much. And so parks have seen a lot of increased traffic from people. And what has this increase in human activity meant for the wildlife in these parks? And can park managers effectively protect those wildlife in our parks while being able to provide the space for us to recreate and spend time in nature? And so in today's webinar, Professor Cole Burton will be sharing his latest research that has been produced by his Wildlife Coexistence Lab and his collaborators. And so they have hundreds of motion detector cameras out that are recording wildlife and humans around parks in Southwestern BC and in some other parts of the world. And so today Cole is going to talk about the data they've collected on wildlife and human recreational activities and the intersection of those two things. So a little bit about Cole. We're very fortunate to have Professor Burton with us today. Cole is an assistant professor in the Department of Forest Resources Management, and he holds the Canada Research Chair in terrestrial mammal conservation. His research is motivated by the challenge of human-wildlife coexistence on an increasingly crowded planet. And so he seeks to support evidence-based policy decisions through an understanding of wildlife responses to a changing environment, changing in many dimensions. Cole specializes in studying terrestrial mammals using camera traps. And so he'll be talking about that work today and talking about how that work informs policy and management and generates recommendations for government, industry, NGOs, as well as contributing to our scientific knowledge. He holds a master's degree in zoology from UBC and a PhD in environmental science from the University of California at Berkeley. He leads the Wildlife Coexistence Lab, and he also teaches courses in wildlife ecology, management, and conservation. Thank you, Cole, for joining us today. And Cole, if you could, here we go. So today you will be able to join the conversation by using the Slido platform. So in order to ask questions or to prioritize the questions of others that you want to see answered, go to slido.com and insert the code UBC Forestry. And in that way, you can enter questions at any time during the seminar, and we'll have a long Q&A session at the end. And you can click on those questions of others that you'd like to see answered. So with that, I'll turn things over to Cole. Go ahead, Cole.
Great, thank you very much, Sally. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I assume if not, somebody will jump in and let me know. But yeah, thank you very much, Sally, for that generous introduction, and thank you to Michelle and the other organizers for the invitation to give this seminar. And of course, thank you all very much for attending. It's a real honor to be able to talk to you today, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions at the end here. So I'm excited today to talk a little bit about some of the research our lab is doing on the effectiveness of parks at protecting wildlife. And I have to start by giving a big shout out to my wonderful lab group here at UBC, the Wildlife Coexistence Lab. I'm very lucky to work with a great group of undergraduate, graduate students and postdoctoral researchers who have really amazed me over the past year with their dedication and hard work despite all the challenges that we've all been facing during the pandemic. So I'm excited to be able to present some emerging work from our lab that's being led by students in the lab. And just by way of brief introduction, Sally already did a great job of it, but we aspire to study interactions between wildlife and people to try and inform improved conservation and management of wildlife. And we particularly focus on larger bodied terrestrial mammals because they often come into conflict with people, but they're also very valued by people, presenting an interesting dilemma. And we consider coexistence defined very broadly. So we do research in a lot of different contexts, including places where large and potentially dangerous carnivores might come into habitats near people, like this black bear snatching some unprotected garbage near Souk in southern Vancouver Island. We also work in areas where our industrial development and resource development is changing habitats that may be very important for threatened species like woodland caribou. And then we work in places where our recreational demands and desires bring us into habitats that are refuges for wildlife. So that's what I'll be talking more about today, this last theme. I would like to also acknowledge that all of our research takes place within different traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to work in these lands. So before I get into this theme of recreation and parks in BC, I want to zoom out and start with some really big picture perspective on protected areas. And as we know, in the face of our growing human population and consumptive demands, we've seen a lot of documented evidence of biodiversity declines around the planet. And our primary response to those declines has really been the establishment and maintenance of protected areas. And this is a updated global map of all these protected areas around the Earth's surface and in the oceans. And we're up to about 250,000 terrestrial protected areas now and about 20,000 marine protected areas. So you can see the growth in these protected areas over time. These are the terrestrial parks growing from 1990 to present. And you may have heard that we're approaching or almost at this target of 17% coverage of the terrestrial land surface, which was the target set called Aichi Target 11. It was the international target set under the Convention for Biological Diversity. So it's great that we're only a year late in meeting that target of protected area coverage, but of course the world is not planning to stop there. And in fact, there's discussions going on now about a post-2020 biodiversity framework and significant increases in the number of protected areas around the planet. So for example, Canada has already committed to protecting 25% of the land surface by 2025. And there are more ambitious targets being discussed, like 30% by 2030 And the most ambitious target is 50% of the Earth set aside in protected areas, what's often called half Earth. So as we contemplate this growth in protected areas and this major strategy for biodiversity conservation, we think it's worth sort of asking how effective recent growth in parks has been at actually protecting biodiversity. And one thing conservation scientists have been really good at in recent decades is developing these priority schemes to identify places where they think protection is most needed. So this is a map showing 9 prominent prioritization schemes around the world, and I'm not going to go through them all, but you're probably familiar with some of them. Like this one is the biodiversity hotspots, which has identified areas around the world that have very high endemism, so high numbers of species that aren't found elsewhere, as well as very high threat from human land transformation and other human disturbances. So these are the kinds of areas that conservationists say we really need to protect these. So one of the big picture questions we were asking in the lab, and this is work being led by Katie Jaden McClement, who's been an undergraduate researcher in our lab and is starting her master's. One of the questions is, has this recent growth in protected areas actually targeted these biodiversity hotspots? And what Katie has found is that, in fact, we're not doing a great job of targeting these areas that are identified as being high need. So this graph here that she's produced shows the growth in protected areas from 1980 to present, and the black line shows high growth in protected areas outside of these hotspots. So these are areas that she's matched based on similar ecological locations and conditions, and we're seeing much lower growth of protected areas inside the hotspots. So they're still growing, but perhaps troubling is that hotspots were defined in 2000, and that's when we see a kind of a leveling out and a divergence with more protected areas going outside of these hotspots. So what this work in progress is suggesting to us is we're not necessarily doing a great job of targeting these new protected areas where they're most needed. And we don't have to look in tropical regions to see this phenomenon. We can see examples of that here in BC, for example, in the South Okanagan, where there's been a long effort and controversy around putting in a new national park in what is one of Canada's biodiversity hotspots in that grassland region. So this is kind of a troubling signal, but still it leaves us with the question of, irrespective of how we continue to add protected areas, how effective are our current parks being at protecting wildlife? And we know parks face many different challenges, from land use changes around their boundaries, creating hard edges, and the associated increases in interactions between people and wildlife, as wildlife, particularly larger mammals, move across these boundaries. So, for example, animals may come out and encounter conflict with people outside of protected areas, like this elephant in Mole National Park in Ghana, and people might be increasingly coming into parks and potentially crowding out wildlife like this moose here in Yellowstone National Park. So this is a very important question to ask, how the parks are doing in protecting wildlife. But unfortunately, we often lack the evidence to answer this basic question, because we often don't have good, robust monitoring programs of wildlife and of threats in parks. And so we've been quite interested in this at a global scale, and have been asking this question by trying to pull together data sets from a tool that we use a lot in our lab, which is what we call camera traps, or remote wildlife cameras. And so the work I'm going to briefly describe here is from a PhD student, Chen in our lab. And Chen has painstakingly pulled together data from over 90 different camera trap survey projects around the world, representing over 8,600 cameras that have collected data on over 300 different mammal species. So you can see the distribution of these survey areas around the globe relative to variation in expected mammal species richness. And Chen's been using this data set to sort of ask what factors are most important in explaining patterns of species diversity in mammals around the world. And in a nutshell, one of the interesting results from Chen's work has been that the extent to which a survey area is covered by a park or a protected area is a major factor in explaining mammal diversity, even after controlling for a lot of key environmental variables like vegetation productivity and climate and things like that we know affect richness. Protected area coverage is very important. So in this graph, you can see this is more protected area coverage for a sample site, and this is less. And both of our measures of diversity that we use, species diversity as well as functional diversity, which captures the ecological or functional roles of species. Both of these are much higher in areas that have more protection. So this is perhaps not a shocking result, and it certainly is just a snapshot in time. It doesn't give us the information on trends over time in terms of how these populations are changing over time. But it is an encouraging sign that that parks are protecting large amounts of mammal diversity around the world. Of course, a global analysis like this averages over a lot of local and regional variation and context. And so this is where I want to get into what's happening in British Columbia's parks. And of course, we're very lucky in BC to have a tremendous protected area network, the third largest network in North America after the Canadian and American national systems. And so this map here from a relatively recent paper shows the British Columbia protected areas in purple, which cover about 14% of our land area. But this map also shows the tremendous amount of land use change happening in the province from our various human activities, including agriculture in orange, forestry in green, and oil and gas in light blue. So parks are increasingly important at protecting habitat for the remarkable biodiversity that we have in BC, which is in fact the highest biodiversity of any province in Canada, province or territory. And in particular, BC is very important for protecting the diversity of large mammal species. So it has the most number of large mammal species of anywhere in North America. And many of these species have had a strong historical range contractions over time, meaning that BC is now kind of at the front lines of these historical contractions. So these maps from an older paper give an idea of this with the showing the ranges of different species, and the pink areas are the areas that have historically been lost or contracted in their range, with the yellow areas being the persistent ranges. So you can see for species like grizzly bear and wolverine and mountain goat, BC really is at the front lines of protection for these species. And these wide-ranging species are really dependent on effective parks to prevent further range loss. But despite the importance of our parks for wildlife in BC, we know that our parks are increasingly under pressure. So, as Sally was mentioning in the introduction, parks are very valued here for recreational opportunities. BC is a supernatural province, and nature tourism is an increasingly important part of our economy. And this has led to rapid growth in visits to protected areas. And so I just plotted out some data available from the BC Parks website to give an idea of this. And we can see from some data collected in the mid-2000s, there's been a dramatic increase in visitors to parks in recent years. And particularly when we look over this 5-year period up to 2019, park visits grew by over 5 million people, up to around 26 million visits a year. So this is really dramatic use of our parks. And one of the sort of poster child parks for this has been Geoffrey Lake's Provincial Park up north of Pemberton. And this has become a real Instagram hotspot. And it kind of epitomizes some of these challenges facing parks. Growth of visits in Geoffrey Lake grew by over 200% in the past decade, up to around 200,000 visitors a year, which is quite a lot for a small park. And this has led park managers to have to develop some new visitor use management strategies, which they're currently trying to put into place. But one of the real challenges facing park managers is to navigate this dual mandate of providing these important recreational opportunities to people, while also protecting the biodiversity that depends on these parks. And when park managers have tried to sort of restrict recreational use, such as putting in day use pass systems or things like that, there's often been quite a bit of pushback where people really want to maintain access to these parks. And I think part of the problem here is that we often lack evidence to clearly understand what the trade-offs are if we allow more or less recreational use in parks. How does that affect wildlife? So that's a really key question that we need to be able to answer. We need to provide evidence for decision makers. And so this has been the motivation for a collaborative project that we started with BC Parks in recent years. And in this project, we've really set out to try and provide some of that evidence of how human recreational use may be affecting wildlife, and particularly to try and use this camera trapping tool to monitor both human use and wildlife responses in parks. So we've been working so far in 5 different parks in southwestern British Columbia, from Golden Hills near us here in Vancouver, up to South Chocon Mountains and out to Cathedral Park in the east. And all of these projects are still ongoing. So we're collecting millions of images of people and wildlife, and working away, several projects in the lab working on this. And I'm going to ask you not to blink for a bit here while I run this time lapse of camera trap detections from a busy trail in Cathedral Park. And you can see lots of people using this trail, but keep your eyes open for wildlife that pop in and out, like that mountain goat. And we think that cameras are a great tool because they're simultaneously monitoring both people and wildlife and how they're using these same places, and whether or not they are using the same places or how they're dividing up time. And you know, you can really see that they are indeed sharing a trail like this. You can see a cougar walking through just moments after people had walked through. So we think it is a very valuable tool. And you will note that we're really just seeing people's legs, and that we've got this, it's not your eyes, there's in fact a blur around people here. Because we are monitoring human activity, we're very sensitive about protecting people's privacy so that we can look at overall visitation and types of recreational uses while maintaining people's privacy while they're using the park. So when we think about how recreation might affect wildlife, we can think about what general patterns we might expect when we go out there and use these cameras to relate human visitation to wildlife. And of course, if there's no effect, we would expect no real patterns. We would expect that people and wildlife would be using the park in sort of a randomized way, or a way where there's not strong associations between them. But if there are significant effects, we might expect that could happen in space. For instance, wildlife might use areas or avoid areas that are having high levels of recreation activity. So we might see some of the spatial segregation or spatial displacement. And another possibility is that wildlife are actually changing the time that they use these areas. So in order to keep using habitats used by people, they might be shifting to become more nocturnal. So people might be using the park primarily during the day, and wildlife might be becoming more nocturnal to try and access resources but avoid people. And of course, you know, we might see a lot of variability in these responses depending on the park or depending on the type of recreational activity, or maybe some species are more sensitive than others to recreation. So these are some of the types of ideas we're trying to test in our work. And so now I'm going to give you just a brief tour of some of these parks that we have active camera trap projects in. And we're going to start with South Chocon Mountains Park up northwest of Lillooet. And this was the first grid that was set up, and it was set up through the hard work and leadership of Dr. Robin Naidu, a collaborator of ours from WWF and adjunct professor at UBC. And South Chocon Mountains is a very interesting park because it protects this large and diverse assemblage of large mammals, but it's also increasingly used for recreation, and particularly it's become a hotspot for mountain biking. So Robin set up a grid of over 60 trail cameras on trails throughout the park using a systematic grid. And so they were in the park as well as in adjacent lands outside of the park. And these have been running now, we're in our 4th year of running these cameras. But after the first year, Robin and I worked on a publication to look at what we were seeing and to ask these questions about whether we were seeing spatial or temporal displacement of wildlife. And so I'm going to really gloss over some of the methods used in our projects, but happy to revisit those during the question period if people have questions. But essentially what I'm showing here is a plot of the effects of different variables on the weekly detection rates of wildlife in the park. So how wildlife were using habitat around the park on a weekly level, and how that was influenced by different types of variables. And what I'll just ask you to focus on is these red variables that represent recreation effects. And in particular, we found two negative associations of recreation with these different wildlife species. And I'm only showing a subset of species here, but these two negative effects were both with mountain biking, and they were on two relatively sensitive species in the area, grizzly bears and moose. So this was kind of a troubling result, even though there was a lot of variability in species responses, and there were very important effects of habitat on these species patterns. We did see these two negative effects of mountain biking. And we also looked more closely at how people and wildlife were sharing space on trails and sharing it in time. And we did that using what we call an avoidance attraction ratio, which essentially tests whether wildlife are displaced after an event where a human recreational activity comes through a trail. So is it longer until the next wildlife detection than it was to the previous wildlife detection? And if there was no effect on that, if humans were not displacing animals in time, then the avoidance attraction ratio would be at 0. So we did indeed find it was above 0 for all the 4 types of recreational activity that we measured: hikers, horseback riders, motorized vehicles outside the park, and mountain bikers primarily inside the park. And you can see it was particularly high for mountain bikers, much higher than it was for hikers or horseback riders, and similar to how it was for motorized vehicles outside the park. So again, these two lines of evidence suggested to us that, hey, mountain biking in this park is having some kind of an effect on both the use of space and the use of that in time by some of these sensitive wildlife species. And so next I want to jump over to Cathedral Park, which is out near Karamillas along the US border, and is another very beautiful park where Mitch Fennell is doing his MSc project in our lab. And Cathedral gets a lot of recreational activity, but it's primarily hiking. So unlike South Chocon Mountains, there's very little mountain biking happening there. And so Mitch and our team have been collecting data from 51 camera traps distributed in this park in a stratified random design. And we've stratified it by looking both on and off trails, because we're interested in seeing what animals are doing off the trails as well as on the trails. And also by stratifying between this sort of core area of the park, which receives a lot of high recreational use, and then some of these lower recreational use areas outside of that core. And so these cameras have been generating some great data on the mammals in the park, and that's also one of our goals, is just to generate some of this baseline data on the mammal communities in these parks. And in this case, it includes data on this relatively small and isolated and threatened mountain goat population in Cathedral, as well as more evidence of predator activity up in this core recreation area than had previously been thought. So some of these predators like cougars and black bears and wolves are using this park more than people had been seeing them. And so Mitch has also been taking a similar approach to what I showed from the paper with Rob and Naidu, where we're using these regression models to try and relate the detections of animals to the detections of recreational activities. And we're also controlling for many other environmental variables in these models, but I'm not talking about those right now. I'm just focusing in on the recreation effect, or the relationship between hikers in this case and wildlife. And so this graph again shows these standardized estimates of the effect of different of recreation, the number of people using these trails. It shows this effect on different species in the park. And so above the line is a positive effect, and below the line is a negative effect. And so what jumps out here in Cathedral is we're not really seeing any statistically significant negative effects. So these are the 95% confidence intervals, and when they overlap 0, that's not a statistically significant effect. So we are seeing some positive associations. So for mountain goat and mule deer, we are seeing them found more often in areas and times with higher recreation. So that's kind of an interesting result, and we're still investigating this, but it does suggest that, or one hypothesis for what might be driving this, is that mountain goats and mule deer may actually see some benefit by being near people, partly because they share habitats, but also partly because people may be pushing away predators. So we do see this trend towards a negative association between humans and cougars. And so this could be a type of predator shield where humans are helping keep predators away from these prey species. But we're still investigating that potential mechanism. And what we're also doing here is looking at how the animals are sharing time in places where they are found with people. And what we seem to see here for mountain goats, which as you just saw, were found more often in areas with more recreationists, is that they're using these areas at different times. So this is an activity plot, which shows the time of day here on the x-axis, and then the frequency of activity by mountain goats and people on this plot. And so this black line here is mountain goat activity, which you can see peaks really early in the morning, and then declines rapidly around the time that hikers hit the trails, and mountain goat detections stay quite low during the day when hikers are busy on the trails. And so this suggests that they may be separating out their time, but of course it could just be their natural pattern. So we've been trying to look at this more closely to see if there's evidence that humans are actually driving this response in mountain goats. And we are seeing evidence that suggests that, because for example, here we've compared the same time of activity for mountain goats on versus off trails. And the on trail is this dark black line here. We can see much more nocturnal activity on the trails by mountain goats, whereas there is more activity during the daytime. This is 12 noon here. So there's more activity during the daytime off trails. So goats seem to be shifting, using the on trails at night when people aren't using them, and then using the off trails more at day. So it seems to be an adaptation by the goats to be able to still use these areas where recreation is high. Next, I want to jump over to Golden Ears Park. And as you likely know, Golden Ears is right on Vancouver's doorstep here. So this map shows Maple Ridge and Pitt Meadows, Coquitlam, these parts of Metro Vancouver that adjoin this park. And Golden Ears is where Michael Procco has been doing his MSc project, running a grid of 58 cameras that span from kind of high use front country recreation areas to some more remote backcountry areas in the park, as well as sampling in the adjacent Malcolm Knapp Research Forest, where there's some lower levels of recreation as well as some active forest harvesting. So we've been running this grid since May 2019, and we've been getting huge amounts of human activity, as you might expect here. Golden Ears can get up to 1 million visitors in a year, and so our cameras have been absolutely flooded with detections of people. And one of the things that Michael's been doing is kind of plotting out the spatial patterns of detections of different species. And so this is a heat map of detections for cougars. And you can see that they are really concentrating a lot of the activity in the park, but there is a fair bit of activity down here closer to where people are. So they are sharing some space definitely with people there. And just as a quick contrast, black bears, you can see, do seem to be much more concentrated here in the front country of the park, closer to the town. So in terms of the modeling, Michael has been leading modeling in a similar fashion to what I showed for South Chilcotins and Cathedral, trying to look at these spatial associations between recreation and wildlife. But he's also been splitting up, like we did in the Chilcotins, splitting up across different types of recreation. So vehicles, horseback riders, mountain bikers, and hikers. But hikers are by far the dominant recreation activity in the park. And so interestingly here, unlike what we saw in Cathedral, here's mule deer, and if you remember, they had a positive association with recreation in Cathedral, which was a lower use park. And here it's marginally non-significant, but it seems to be more of a negative association between deer and recreation in this very high use park. And we're also seeing some statistically significant negative associations for other species. For instance, black bear are negatively associated with hikers and bobcat as well, and close to a negative association here with cougars. So we're continuing to add data to these studies, but it does seem that in this higher use park, we are seeing more negative responses of wildlife habitat use in space with the hiking activity. And we're also looking, as with the other parks, we're looking at how time is being used by wildlife. And here, just the same type of activity plot. This is focusing in on cougars, which we've been thinking a lot about because of their potential for conflict. Of course, you've probably been hearing about some of the conflict over in the Coquitlam area here. This plot shows the activity time of people here, peaking during the day when people are on the trails. And you can see cougars are lower activity at that time and tend to be higher outside of that time in the early morning or in the evening. And again, we've been trying to split that up by their activity on and off trails and getting some interesting results here where it does seem that we're seeing more cougar detections during the day off trail on this blue line here. Whereas on trails, they tend to be using the trails more at night. So again, this kind of adaptation to be avoiding people, but still able to use these areas where people are frequent. So it's been interesting for us to see these different responses across these 3 parks so far. And you know, we are seeing some of this evidence of spatial and temporal shifts by wildlife in response to recreation, but we're also seeing a lot of variation across species and across sites. And so we think it's important to try and consider the landscape context of these parks and the relative types and levels of recreation. So what we're working on doing now is scaling up to include more parks in our analysis, to really look across a whole range of different parks and try and see if there are general patterns that we can pull out. So this is work in progress that we're doing as part of the WildCam Network, which our lab has helped to get going. And this is a network of camera trap researchers and practitioners that we've assembled in the past couple of years. We've got over 140 members and over 60 different projects that have signed on, and we're looking to increase that because we know that there are a lot of people using this camera trap survey tool out there. And so a postdoc in our lab, Alice Granados, is working on a subset of these projects, these 9 projects shown in this map here, trying to pull together data across all these projects to see, you know, what are the key differences we see in these different landscapes. For instance, South Chocotans and Cathedral had some species present that are no longer present or very rare in a park like Golden Ears. So what are these park level differences that we're seeing, and what do they tell us about these recreational impacts? So this is work in progress that we don't have the results to report yet, but I hope you'll stay tuned for some more results from Alice and our team on this synthesis. And the last thing I wanted to kind of talk about here is kind of an unexpected direction that our research took over the past year in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, you know that human activity has been radically transformed by the pandemic. And that started out with all the lockdowns we saw during the first wave, including closures in all of the provincial parks in BC. And you know, this kind of provided an unexpected but unprecedented experiment, if you will, where we could try and learn more about how wildlife would respond to these rapid and drastic changes in human activity. And so other scientists have called this the anthropos, this sort of pause in anthropogenic activity that provides us with this learning opportunity. And of course, we know it's not just the lockdowns or closures that was the change, but in fact, we've seen after the lockdowns, we've seen incredible increases in use of many of our parks as we've been forced to get outside to stay physically distant, as well as we've been prevented from traveling outside the province. So our parks have seen a lot of increased use. So just to go back to Golden Ears for a second, we've really seen a real opportunity to study this in a park like Golden Ears. And so this is work that Michael did, plotting out just our detections of people over time at Golden Ears. So the bar is how many people were detected at our cameras in each day. And you can see this period of park closure in April and May when the park was shut down to no visitors. And then after reopening, you can see these really high levels of use in the park. So we've been trying to test the relationship between wildlife and this closure to see what were animals doing during this closure period. And here's just an example of some of this emerging work. 3 species where we looked at the detection rates previous to the closure, during the closure, and after the closure. And you can see that for cougars, there's this marked increase in their detections during the closure period, and it's down before and down again after. Whereas for deer and black bear, we don't see that kind of response. So this gives us another insight into the suggestion that cougars are responding and more sensitive to changes in human activity than some of the other species. And this is a research direction that we're actively pursuing. Thanks to our partners at BC Parks, they had the good sense to recognize that Geoffrey Lakes, which I mentioned earlier as a hotspot of visitation, Geoffrey Lakes was closed for public safety reasons and remains closed. And so our parks collaborators suggested that we get cameras into Geoffrey Lakes to try and understand how wildlife are responding during the closure. And we did that, and we're comparing it with a portion of Garibaldi Park here, which is similar, a trail going up to Garibaldi Lake, but it opened after that initial period of closure. So it's receiving high levels of recreation, whereas Geoffrey Lakes is closed and receiving no recreation. So we're actively in the middle of collecting data for this project. And again, I can't really give you any results yet, other than a little teaser to say that so far in the data we've collected, we're detecting more mammal species in Geoffrey Lake than we are in a comparable area of Garibaldi. So this is very preliminary, take that with a grain of salt, but it is kind of an intriguing result for us, suggesting that maybe these responses are happening at this park level and at these high levels of change of human use, rather than some of these less severe gradients within parks. So we're also trying to capitalize on this anthropos, this change in human activity associated with COVID-19, by leading a synthesis of other camera trap researchers around the world. So we've already assembled data from over 50 different projects where people have had camera traps running in parks and other areas before, during, and after these changes in human activity associated with the pandemic. So we're actively trying to analyze these data and hope that we can really ask some big picture questions about how wildlife are responding to changes in human activity. So just to wrap up here, I think obviously, I hope I've given you a taste of some of the work we have going on in the lab on this question. Obviously, we're at the early stages and we're just really beginning to start to understand some of the patterns out there. We have good evidence, of course, that people and wildlife are sharing these parks. We know that the parks provide critical habitat for these types of mammal species, but they're also very important for recreation. And we're seeing that recreation is causing some species to shift both in space and in time, but the effects are quite variable across parks and across recreation types and across species. So we're seeing many species not showing a strong response, or maybe even showing some attraction to hikers in parks, which can be its own form of problem. But I think what we don't know yet is what are the long-term consequences of these changes for wildlife in parks. We really need to link these behavioral changes to population level dynamics of wildlife to see if this is just an adaptation for wildlife to coexist, or if they're in fact being detrimentally impacted over the long term by these changes. And we need to particularly consider that in the context of these growing recreational pressures. So one thing we're trying to identify is whether there are actually thresholds in disturbance beyond which we see more pronounced effects on wildlife. But to be able to ask these questions, we really need this kind of rigorous monitoring of both park visitation and wildlife responses. And this has been difficult to do in the past, and I think requires a new level of sustained support for parks to be able to establish and run these kinds of monitoring programs to really understand how our growing recreation pressures are impacting wildlife. So I'll stop there, and I'd be very happy to take questions. I just want to thank everyone who's been involved in this work and continues to be involved, and particularly all our collaborators at BC Parks. So thank you very much for listening.
So thanks very much, Cole. Really fascinating work, really interesting, and we have a lot of excellent questions on Slido. So I am going to get straight to those. So first of all, are there any studies or evidence on how the temporal shift in wildlife use affects overall fitness and continued occupancy?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. That's kind of a next direction in wildlife. So or in our studies. I'm not sure. I mean, we can imagine how it could affect wildlife if they're being prevented access to certain resources when they need them. For instance, if prey are using things at different time from predators, then predators might have a harder time getting their prey because of that temporal shift. Or it could be like a stress level effect. If animals are just being warier, that could have some physiological effects on their stress. But that's all kind of conjecture, and I don't think we have that detailed level of knowledge yet. There are definitely some projects starting up to, for instance, on mountain goats in some of the national parks to look at stress hormones and try and link some of these behavioral shifts to actual changes in animal fitness. But I think we haven't done that yet. So it's a great question.
Thank you. A really interesting area. So next, would it be better overall for wildlife provincially, at a provincial level, to allow heavy use of the parks that are near human density centers, or to distribute use more evenly across all the parks, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, that's another great question. I mean, I do think we need to be thinking about those types of questions, and so I don't think it's practical or desirable to shift use evenly, because we know that some areas are very important for these larger, more sensitive species like grizzly bears or wolverine. And if we dramatically increased recreation in some of these areas, we might predict that would have a stronger effect on those species. Also, I think it would be hard to get people to those recreation sites. But we have to be careful too, because in some of the areas, like for instance in golden ears, our cameras have been detecting spotted skunks, which is a very rare species that's restricted to just this sort of southern BC lower mainland area. And so if we sort of abandon that park to just human use, then that might be the last type of protection that was afforded to species that are restricted in their distribution like that. So I think we need to try and strike a balance where, yes, we're going to have some parks that are more emphasizing human use and some that are more emphasizing biodiversity protection, wildlife protection. But I think we need to be keeping an eye on wildlife even in the high use areas.
Yeah, really just so challenging to manage these questions. So a late question that got a lot of votes instantly is, do you have data on dogs' effects on wildlife?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question too. So certainly we do. When we're processing all the imagery, we record whether or not they're dogs and whether or not they're on or off leash. And so that's something that we're digging into. And we don't really have an answer to that question yet. There have been some studies in other places with kind of mixed results, I think. One in California I know of was suggesting that dogs in parks were having quite an effect on some of the carnivore species, whereas some work in the eastern US suggested that it didn't seem to be, whether or not people were with dogs, didn't seem to have a big effect, even if the dogs were off leash. So we're very interested in asking that question, and I think the BC Parks managers are quite interested in that as well, because that's something they can directly try and manage in terms of whether dogs are allowed, whether they have to be on leash, how that's being enforced. So yeah, we're digging into that, but unfortunately I don't have an answer to that just yet.
Right. Well, good question. Okay, so in terms of processing images, which you just mentioned, do you use AI to filter and analyze the images, or is classification still done manually?
Yeah, great question. So the answer is a bit of both. We have been doing a lot of manual processing of the images with our graduate students and teams of undergraduate students, which is great opportunity for them to learn about the species. And also there's a lot of value in looking at the photos ourselves, because we see what's going on. We see much more about the behavior of the animal, sometimes the body condition or health of the animal, whether or not sometimes we see them with prey in their mouth. So we learn a lot by actually looking at the images ourselves. But at the same time, as we kind of add more projects, the volume of images is becoming more challenging. So what we've been doing is using artificial intelligence machine learning tools to automatically classify the photos of people, because in a park like Golden Ears, that's just critical. You know, there's so many photos of people. So we do that. It tells us whether it's an animal or a person. It automatically blurs the photo of people, so it protects their privacy. And then we can focus in on the manual classification of the wildlife, because the AI tools that we've tried for wildlife are pretty variable in their accuracy. They're promising and they're getting better all the time, but they're still prone to making mistakes, and those are mistakes that we don't want. You know, we don't want to have one of those spotted skunk photos misidentified, or a rare wolverine photo missed, or something like that. So we do tend to focus on the manual classification, but we're trying to help train these AI tools, because we know that many of our partners who don't have as much time to manually process the images would really benefit from a reasonably accurate automated classifier.
Right, right. Yeah, it's fun to follow people working on camera trap data on Twitter and see all the posts of what is this
Yeah.
from the
Well,
tricky
exactly.
photos. So I can only imagine.
Yeah, we always use the nicer images for presentations, but sometimes we just get a tail or a foot or a face smushed up in the camera, and it can be a lot harder to figure out what that is, and certainly hard sometimes for the computers to figure that out too, if it's hard for us.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I'm delighted to see that Tori Stevens is on the call and on your webinar, and she asked the question, and so Tori is recently retired BC provincial ecologist for BC Parks, and she asked, how do you explain the difference in high use parks between hikers and mountain bikers compared to low use parks?
Well, first of all, I should point out that Tori and you, Sally, were a big reason of why we got some of this work started in Cathedral Park with support from the Living Labs program. So thank you so much, Tori, for joining. And so the question is, why do we see the difference between the high use and low use parks in mountain biking and hiking? Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Like, I think in South Dakota mountains, the volume of mountain biking was surprisingly high. Like, it was by far our highest level of detection of any species or human activity, twice as many detections of mountain bikers as the most commonly detected wildlife, which was mule deer, and you know, 5 times as many as of hikers. So there's a lot of mountain biking activity happening there. Whereas in Golden Ears, there's not very much mountain biking activity, but there's tremendous amount of hiking. So whether it's specific to the activities or it's more of a volume effect, I don't think we need some more replication from different parks to tease that out. You know, we've had some speculation around, okay, mountain biking is fast, so it may be more likely to scare animals and push them further away. But you know, I think we are just speculating at this point, and certainly that makes some sense. But you know, hikers can be loud and in groups, and moving more slowly maybe provides like a more prolonged disturbance. So I think we do need to keep asking that question by comparing in different situations and comparing over time, and particularly if new management guidelines are put in place that either restrict or increase the amount of activity. That's where I think we should really be set up to sort of look at the effects before and after those changes, like we did fortuitously with the pandemic closures. But if a new mountain biking trail is going in, if we can get some data from before it goes in and look after, that's where we're going to have more power to really understand these effects. Because at this point, we're still looking at correlations and then trying to make a story. So it is a bit difficult for us. I feel like we're still in the early stages of that.
Yeah, it's all it's such interesting work, and the anthropos, which is a great name, has really maybe indicated some value around putting pauses in place periodically for wildlife. And that was one of the questions, was whether there's any talk about instituting anthroposes in the future to give wildlife populations a break. I think it's a great question, but I also am cognizant of the time, and it's about time we wrapped up. So you may want to, I welcome you to make a few closing comments. If you'd like to comment on the anthropos, idea as part of that, that would be great. But if you could just send people away with a few messages, that would be awesome.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Sally. And that is a great question. And I do think it kind of opens up this new dimension, because we do sort of think about protection as static, like, okay, this area is set aside and it's not getting, it's dedicated for wildlife as opposed to people. But really, I think we do need to be thinking dynamically. And it may be that at certain times when wildlife are sensitive, during the breeding period, or if we know a population has declined, then we need to put in these temporally restricted pauses or something like that relieve that pressure, because we're really talking about recreation pressures as sort of being cumulative with the other things that wildlife are having to contend with. So we saw that it's not like this overwhelming response to recreation in these parks we're looking at, but these add on with other types of pressures the wildlife are facing. So I do think that we need to be open to that. And there's going to be pushback, as we've seen, when we try and propose, or when managers try and propose closures to areas or at certain times. And so I think we do need to seek the evidence to help us navigate these trade-offs. We do need to be willing to find creative ways to support monitoring by parks so that they can provide the evidence. And obviously, recreationists value wildlife, they value the parks, and they're huge supporters of the parks. But they don't want to be excluded if there isn't that evidence suggesting, like, yes, this is a time where the wildlife are sensitive, or this is a place where they're more sensitive, and we know that because we have some evidence. And it's a tall task, but I think that it's going to be much more helpful than kind of shooting in the dark about what effects we might be having, because then people just fall back on emotions and opinions that they already have. But if we can all be open to new evidence and try and find ways of supporting these monitoring systems, I think it'll be really helpful in trying to navigate some of these difficult trade-offs.
Yeah, great point. Managing based on data rather than on anecdotes seems like a big step ahead.
Yeah.
So on the point of data, one of the last questions that I know the answer to was has any of the data on wildlife avoidance of mountain bikes in the Chocon been published? And I know you and Robin Naidu did publish that work. So you might just mention where people could find it, and then
absolutely. And I'd be very happy for anyone to email me for a copy of that paper. It's an open access paper, so anybody can go to this journal down here. If you can see this, Conservation Science and Practice, Robin Naidu, the lead author. And so that's an open access paper, so people are welcome to look at that. And I'll just use that opportunity to plug also that Robin and the team is continuing to work on these data. So we now have a few more years of data. We're still seeing these mountain biking effects, but we're trying to do more sophisticated analysis on it now. So stay tuned for more of that. But yes, please go check out that paper and follow up with any questions to Robin or myself.
Great. So Cole, with that, I want to thank you for a tremendous seminar. I want to thank the 160 or so people who joined us for your seminar today. Thank them for coming, and we look forward to seeing all of you or hearing you for a future seminar. So stay tuned. Thanks very much. Fabulous seminar, Cole.
Great. Thank you, Sally, and thanks everyone.